If you were to say the theme of the book of Job in one word, what would you say? Suffering. Does anybody say anything different? Patience. That's actually how James refers to Job in James 5 and verse 11. He uses Job as an example of patience, maybe perseverance is the more specific word he uses. Any others? Obedience. Testing. Faith. Yeah. I think my button's not working. That's what I think. An argument could be made that the book of Job is about God. Does that sound too simplistic? When we take a look at the challenge that Satan gives to God in this first trial in chapter 1, we might say, you know what, the book of Job is about God. But we'll get to that in just a moment. Well, I skipped one. There we go. We don't know who the author of the book of Job is. We don't know. We presume it's Job. That's a good guess. We don't know. Steve, I think it's automatically advancing. Do you know how to correct that? We don't. Do what? Talk fast. We don't know where the book of Job was written. We don't know where Job lived. We know where his friends were from, but we don't know where he was from. We don't know the time that things take place in the book of Job. As I was reading on it this morning, a man who knows the Hebrew language much better than I do said that the dialect that is used in the book of Job does not match any other book in the Old Testament. So that doesn't help us. There's a lot of parallels between some passages in the book of Job and some passages in the rest of the Old Testament. That doesn't help us any because, for example, if Isaiah refers to something that Job refers to, well, is Isaiah referring to Job or is Job referring to Isaiah? I think a good argument could be made that the book of Job, that the events in the book of Job take place during the book of Genesis, which might mean that the book of Job, at least its events, are the first book in Old Testament history. And the reason why I say that is this. The religious practices that are visualized in the book of Job, referred to in the book of Job and so forth, don't have any basis in the law of Moses. There's no references to the law. There's no references to behaviors that the law required. There's no references to priests. In fact, who is the one offering burnt offerings in chapter 1? Job himself. Well, where does that put perhaps the events in the book of Job? During the time of the patriarchs. Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. They were the ones who, you got it fixed? Thank you, sir. They were the ones who took the lead in worshiping on behalf of their families. Now, that's not decisive, but if we needed to know all that information, God would have told us. So, verses 1 through... Steve, I thought you said it was fixed. So, in verse 1, we see where Job is from Uz. That's how you'd pronounce it if we were reading Hebrew. Uz. But that's not how it's spelled in English. How do we pronounce it? Uz. But it should be Uz. But that doesn't sound good, does it? We get so used to saying things all the time. In fact, I pronounce Old Testament words typically the way my mama did, because she was my Bible class teacher for years. Regardless, that's where Job was from. Uz is only mentioned a few times, you see on the screen there in the Old Testament. Not exactly sure where it was located. Job himself is mentioned 58 times. Most of those are in the book of Job, which makes sense. Ezekiel refers to Job, which means whenever Job was written, it had already been written by the time Ezekiel lived. Now, Ezekiel lived during the Babylonian exile. That's the 500s BC. And Ezekiel mentions Job in the same context that he mentions Daniel, when he says, if a man were as righteous as Job living in Jerusalem at this time, it would not save Jerusalem from destruction by the Babylonians. And then, as I've already mentioned, Job is mentioned one time in the New Testament, and that's by James in James 5 and verse 11, where he points to Job's patience or perseverance. Now, how do you describe the character of Job? How does the author describe the character of Job? Tell me again. Perfect and upright. What else? Blameless. What else? Fear God. What else? Turned away from evil. He skewed evil for those who like to use the King James translation. Notice at the very beginning of the book of Job, the author, whoever it is, tells us that Job was a righteous man. Not only does the author of the book tell us that Job was a righteous man, but God's going to tell us, Satan, in the exact same words, that Job was a righteous man. So whatever Job experiences, is it because he was sinful? No. It's the exact opposite, in fact. He experiences what he experiences because he was a good man. He was a righteous man. The word perfect, turn over to chapter 8 and verse 20. The word perfect is the word that's used relative to the animal sacrifices, that they were perfect specimens. It's the same word. When God tells Abraham to walk before me and be perfect, Genesis 17 and verse 1, that's this word. And what that tells us is it is possible for a human being to be perfect in the eyes of God. It is possible for a human being to be perfect in the eyes of God. Does that mean Job was sinless? No. Because perfect in the Bible doesn't mean sinless. It means complete. Remember, Job was offering burnt offerings, so Job was practicing animal sacrifices in case his children sinned, right? That's verse 5 of chapter 1. Chapter 8 and verse 20 is his friend Bildad. Notice he says, Lo, God will not reject a man of integrity, nor will he support the evildoers. Integrity in that verse is the same word perfect in our verse back in chapter 1. Turn over to chapter 9. This is Job describing himself. Chapter 9, verses 20 through 22. Job says, Though I am righteous, my mouth will condemn me. Though I am guiltless, he will declare me guilty. I am guiltless. I do not take notice of myself. I despise my life. Job was a good man. He was a righteous man. And if we were to read, and we'll look at his speeches, we'll see that Job did a lot of things that a good man would do. Job fulfilled whatever God's commandments he had. Job fulfilled them to the best that you can do as a human being. So he was perfect. Number 2, he was upright. That Hebrew word means straight. He was upright. Turn over to chapter 4 and verse 7. We'll look at this chapter more in depth in 2 weeks. But Eliphaz, another friend, says, Remember now whoever perished being innocent, or where were the upright destroyed? When you read the friends' speeches, I want you to ask yourself, is what they are saying true? I believe you'll find over and over again that what the friends say as far as theology is concerned, what they say is true. It's their application of that to Job's situation that's wrong. So keep that in mind as you read through their speeches. This idea of being upright or straight relates to staying faithful, of course, to God's expectations. And again, if we looked at Job's speech, specifically the one in chapter 31, as Job describes his behavior, he describes himself as one who is upright in the eyes of God. In other words, he took care of the widows and he took care of the orphans. In Uz, where he lived, he says, I sat in the gate and I judged righteously. So in that period of time, court was held in the gate of the city. And so that's why there's lots of references to sitting in the gate of the city. And Job was there trying to make sure that his family and friends and neighbors were being judged correctly. He feared God, the author tells us, 3 times. Chapter 1, verse 1, that's the author. Chapter 1, verse 8 is God talking about Job. And chapter 2 and verse 3 is God talking about Job a second time. So Job feared God. He was a righteous man. And he stayed away from evil, turned away from evil. So Job was a good man, the author tells us. And not only that, spiritually speaking, but materially speaking, he was a wealthy man, wasn't he? The author tells us that he had 7 sons and 3 daughters, so he had a big family, 10 kids. How many do you have, Geneva? I mean, in your family, not your children, but 17. Job wasn't that wealthy. Y'all were wealthy with 17 kids in West Virginia, weren't you? So Job had a big family, and Job loved his family. His family spent time together, didn't they? The text gives us this idea in verse 5. The days of feasting had completed their cycle. Job would send and consecrate them, rising up early in the morning, offering burnt offerings according to the number of them all. In the verse before that, his sons used to go and hold a feast, and sons there probably is being used generically to refer to all of his children. So his kids used to go and hold a feast in the house on each one on his day. Now, what day is that probably? His birthday. So his kids would go to each other's house and celebrate their birthdays together. So they were a close-knit family. They loved being together. They loved celebrating each other's birth. And then in verse 3, we've got the reference to his material wealth, 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels. In the early days of biblical history, camels were a sign of wealth. Camels were a sign of wealth. So he had 3,000 of them. What does that tell you about Job? That's a lot of camels. He had 500 yoke of oxen, which tells us that he had a lot of land that had to be plowed. He's wealthy. 500 female donkeys. There's actually a word in the Hebrew specifically for female donkey. And female donkeys were more valued than male donkeys because of the milk that they gave, and of course because they could give birth to other donkeys that could be used in the field. And lots of servants. And notice that the author said he was the greatest, verse 3, the greatest of all the men of the East. So the author is painting a very positive picture, isn't he? If we were to put it in American terms, he is the quintessential American. 2.5 kids, 2-story house, white picket fence, the whole shebang. That's Job. And he sacrificed, verse 5 says he sacrificed for his family, serving as priest. Now, Satan shows up. Verse 6. There was a day when the sons of God came to appear before Jehovah God. And the attacks of Satan on Job's prosperity, we're going to see in verses 9 and 10 that Satan attacks the idea that God deserves to be worshiped even if he doesn't bless materially. And that's the reason why I suggest to you that God might be the theme of the book of Job. The nature of God, his goodness, his faithfulness. And so the sons of God appear before God. Here in the book of Job, the expression sons of God clearly refers to angels. This expression is used 1, 2, 3 times. Over in chapter 38 and verse 7, which is a chapter we'll look at the very end of our 3-month walk through Job, God will say that the sons of God were there at the creation, and they sang when God created the world. These are angels. The expression sons of God is only used one other time in the Old Testament, and that's in Genesis chapter 6, when Moses writes that the sons of God married the daughters of men. The most prominent view of who the sons of God are in chapter 6 of Genesis is that they're angels. That's the commonly accepted view in scholarship. There's a major problem with that. What's the problem with angels marrying humans? What's the problem with that? They're separate species of created being. Jesus says, of course, in his discussion with the Sadducees, that when humans die and go to heaven, we're like angels and we're not marrying nor given in marriage. We have no sexual urges. We don't need to procreate in heaven. So the sons of God in Genesis 6 are not angels. They're human beings that come from the family of Seth. But study of Genesis is for another time. So among the sons of God, there is the Satan who appears. What is the definition of the Satan? Evil? The evil one? Anybody else? Adversary. The text here, in fact, has the definite article in front of Satan. The Satan. The definition of the word Satan is adversary. He's not called Satan as a name until we get later in biblical history to 1 Chronicles and the book of Zechariah. Here, clearly, it's the same. I mean, it's the Satan, the one we know of as Satan, the devil. Yeah, New American Standard doesn't either. But it's there in Hebrew. So the adversary shows up. And who is he an adversary of? He's God's adversary, and specifically in this book, he's Job's adversary, right? He's everybody's adversary, and the rest of the Bible will explain that. Now, here's the interesting thing: is Satan mentioned in the book of Genesis? Not by name, right? But he does appear in the form of the serpent. Genesis chapter 3 and verse 1. If the book of Job was written sometime during the period of the patriarchs, then the Israelites knew of Satan's existence and his work from the very beginning. From the very beginning. Without the book of Job, we don't get the idea of the existence, really the nature of this antagonist to human beings until, again, later in Old Testament history, 1 Chronicles. But if Job was written during the time frame of the book of Genesis, then Israel knew that joker existed from the very beginning. I find that's interesting to meditate on. So those are the verses on the screen where the word Satan is used in the Old Testament. Now, again, how does God describe Job? Perfect, upright, fears God, stays away from evil. Exact same word. Look at it, verse 8. The exact same words as the author used of Job back up in verse 2. So not only does the author believe that Job is righteous, God is saying Job is righteous. So God asks Satan, okay, what have you been up to? And Satan says, well, I've been walking around, minding my own business, tempting this person, tempting that person. And God says, well, consider my servant Job. Consider my servant Job. Notice what God says about Job. He is my servant. The bad things that happened to Job isn't because he was a wicked man. It isn't because he was a servant of Satan. Again, it's because, in fact, it's the exact opposite. It's because he was a righteous man. And notice that God is the first one to bring Job to Satan's attention. What have you been doing, Job? Well, I've been walking around testing people's faith. How about Job? Job's sitting over there in the corner saying, oh, no, God, please don't bring me into this. God's the one that holds Job up as an example of righteousness, and he identifies him as my servant. Now, as we go through, and I hope you've read the book of Job before more than once, but as we go through the book of Job and all the highs and lows that Job experiences, and really it's more lows than highs, isn't it? At the very end of the book, in chapter 42, verses 7 and 8, God will once again say, Job is my servant. Whatever Job has said and whatever challenges his faith has sustained through all of this, God still says, that's my servant. That should encourage us. He knows we can't be sinless all the time. So let's look at verses 9 and 10, because verses 9 and 10 really sets the stage for the rest of the book. Yes, ma'am. Chapter 1. So why'd you ask the question? So, according to Satan, why did Job serve God? Notice verses 9 and 10. Satan answered the Lord and says, does Job fear God for nothing? Is Job serving you for nothing? Verse 10, have you not made a hedge about him and his house and all that he has on every side? You've blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. Verse 11, put forth your hand now and touch all that he has. He will surely curse you to your face. So why does Job serve God according to Satan? All of his blessings. You're bribing Job, Satan says. You're not worth serving because of who you are. The only reason why he serves you is because you give him stuff. You take away the stuff and he'll quit serving you. In fact, he'll curse you to your face. There's a good question for us there, isn't there? Why do we serve God? Is it because he gives us stuff? Or is it because God deserves to be served because of who he is? So Satan believes that if God takes away all of these, the hedges is what he calls these blessings, if he takes away these hedges, Job will curse God. Do we have a price? What's our price for being faithful to God? If somebody in our family turns their back on God, will we follow them into apostasy? If we have a child that walks away from Christ, are we going to give up our beliefs in Christ because our child has given up their beliefs in Christ? What's our price? Do we have one? We're going to find that Job doesn't have a price. He doesn't know, he doesn't understand everything that's going on because he views things the same way his friends do. And we'll talk more about that when we get into Eliphaz's speech. But Job doesn't give up his integrity. Gail? He's using hedges here as a reference to the blessings that God has given him.
Because I kind of got it that he was protected from everything around. He had a hedge around him like a fence that he couldn't get hurt or protection. Because it says his house.
Maybe.
Hedge around him about his house.
So you're thinking that Satan is saying you are protecting Job from bad happening. Maybe.
I mean, I know he was blessed by God richly, but that hedge thing really kind of.
It still reflects the same idea. Job is serving you because these protections that you put up. Now, What is the first limitation that God puts on Satan here in this appearance? You can't kill him. Do anything you want to Job, but you can't take his life. Look at verse 12. All that he has is in your power, only do not put forth your hand on him. Now, let me back up for just a second. All of these things that Job experiences, all of these bad things that Job experiences, who's the one behind them? Who's the one behind all these tragedies? Satan. Your Calvinists, the people who follow John Calvin, which is the majority of the Protestant world, will say God is the one that causes all the bad things that happen in this world. Charles Spurgeon, have y'all heard of Charles Spurgeon? Very famous Baptist preacher from the 1800s, preached in Great Britain. I just got finished reading a book of sermons that he preached on the book of Job. And he says, if God takes your child, you ought to be thankful. Because you're probably going to idolize your child, and your child would lead your heart away from God. So you ought to be thankful that God takes your child's life. That's Calvinism. That's John Calvin's thinking. And I think that's blasphemous. The instigator behind these challenges to Job here is Satan, not God. And the book of Job is clear about that. So now Satan goes out and he starts attacking Job. He can't touch Job personally, so what does he do? He kills his oxen and his donkeys, verse 14, and all the servants that take care of them. And then he kills his sheep and all the servants that take care of them. And then he kills the camels and all the servants that take care of them. And then he summarizes everything by killing the kids. All in one day. How does the author portray the intense bombardment of this negative news about Job's losses? How does the author portray that bombardment? Did you pick up on that? Notice verse 16. While the first messenger was still speaking about the death of the ox and the donkeys. And then verse 17, while the messenger was still speaking about the death of the sheep and the servants. Verse 18, while the messenger was still speaking about the death of the camels and the servants. In other words, we get the picture that one messenger is coming right after another and saying, Job, these animals and the servants are dead. Job, these animals and the servants are dead. Job, these animals and the servants are dead. Job is not having time to process all of this. Doesn't it take time to process bad news? If you've heard of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, she was the psychologist who came up with the stages of grief that we go through when somebody close to us dies. Job doesn't have any time to go through any kind of process. It's just bad news after bad news after bad news. And he's lost everything that is important to him. He's lost his ability to make wealth. And most painful of all, no doubt, is the loss of his kids. And of course, Satan is behind it all. Now, how did Job respond to this first attack? He worshiped God. Verse 20, Job rose, tore his robe, shaved his head, which of course are signs of mourning. Naturally, he lost his kids. He fell to the ground and worshiped. This is the only time in this book that the verb to worship is used. 169 times in the whole Old Testament, only here in the book of Job. Literally, it means to kneel. So it does not always refer to worship. Sometimes it just means to kneel. So Job worships. Is that how we respond when we go through tragedy? Unfortunately, too many Christians go through tragedy and they decide to stay home. Why are we going to take out our tragedy on God and refuse to worship Him? How do you survive without that fellowship and without the presence of God and worship? Donna knows firsthand. Job got up and worshiped. His heart ached. We know that for sure. But he also went to God and worshiped. And notice what he says in verse 21. How would you summarize that expression of Job's faith in verse 21? How would you summarize it? Okay. It's not exactly a summary, but blessed be the name of the Lord.
So did the Lord take the children away?
No, ma'am. Satan did. God allowed Satan to take the kids. From that perspective, of course, God is in charge of everything that happens in the world, right? Everything that happens in the world happens with God's permission. But it does not all happen with God's approval. And there's a big difference. So God allowed Satan to do this, but you might say God didn't approve of it. From another perspective, of course, God did approve because he allowed it to happen. But God knew Job's faith, didn't he? God knew what Job could handle. So Job acknowledges that he's been taken back to the time when he was born. Naked I came out of my mother's womb. I didn't have anything when I was born. And now I don't have anything. And that's the way we'll all go. There's no trailer hitches on hearses, are there? Except every once in a while you'll see a picture on Facebook like that. Now, Job, not the author, and I'm assuming the author is Job, but not the author, but Job himself does not know that Satan is behind it. Okay? He doesn't know about this conversation that God and Satan are having in heaven. He doesn't know about that at the time the events are happening. And of course, that's the reason why he winds up blaming God for all of this as we go through the account. But he still blesses God. In fact, later on in chapter 19, he will make this statement of faith. He will say, even if God kills me, I will trust him. That's a powerful statement of faith. But Job doesn't come to that conviction easily. In fact, he trusts God despite what he's going through, not because of what he's going through. I did not say that, but we do not know. There's really no time frames in the book of Job. Yeah, we don't know. So when Satan comes back to God the second time, we're in chapter 2 now, when Satan comes back to God the second time, there's one thing that God says differently about Job than the first time, and what was that? He maintains his integrity. You have taken away everything Job has, and you've killed his children, and yet he maintains his integrity. So here in chapter 2 and verse 3, God says everything about Job that he says the first time. He still praises Job's righteousness, and he fears God, stays away from evil and so forth, but he maintains his integrity. He still holds to what he knows is right. And family, that should be said about me and you regardless of what we go through. We still need to maintain our integrity. Hold fast to Jesus Christ and his teachings. That word hold fast is the verb to hold strongly to his integrity. And that word integrity is related to this word for perfect or blameless in the American Standard. He holds to his blamelessness. And as we go through Job's speeches, we will see over and over again where Job will say, I have not sinned badly enough to deserve this. In essence, that's what he's going to argue. Now, you and I know that he's not being punished because he sinned. But that's not how Job thinks. Job thinks if you're suffering, it's because you sinned. It's called retribution theology, and we'll talk about that in 2 weeks. If you're suffering, it's because you sinned. If you're suffering, it's because God is punishing you for your sin. That's what Job's friends believe, and I think that's what Job believed, but he's finding out that it's not true. It's not true in his case, because he'll argue over and over again. In fact, later on in chapter 31 and verse 6, Job will say, I will maintain my integrity until I die. That he never sinned enough to deserve what he
Because that thought went through in the New Testament that person sinned when something bad happened, like the blind man.
Yes, the disciples believe that same thing, right? John chapter 9 and verse 2, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he should be born blind? They believe that same thing. And of course, it was false in the New Testament times, just like it was false in the Old Testament times. So Satan says, skin for skin, all that a man has he will give for his life. What does he mean by that expression, skin for skin? The scholar suggests that it means something like, these are my words, it means something like everybody has a price. Satan's got a price. Satan has a breaking point. Satan says to God, you just haven't found it yet. So let me push a little harder, Satan says, and we'll find Job's breaking point. And Job will curse you to your face.
Verse 3, where God says He's held His integrity, even though you incited me against Him, like you're trying to make Him think I've done this to Him.
Yeah. So God accuses Satan of making Job think that God's the one that's behind it all. Yeah, no reason. How many times is the word integrity found in the book of Job? Anybody find that out? The whole book. You got to use a concordance for that. 3 in the first couple of chapters. Anybody found out? I can tell you from the New American Standard translation. 6 times. In the whole book. Which, again, is related to that word for perfect, your translation, or blameless. That's what the word integrity means. Now, when Satan comes before God this second time, what limitation does God put on Satan this time?
Well, He still has to spare His life.
Verse 6. God says to Satan, you can do anything you want to Job, but you can't kill him. Now here's something, family, that I think you and I can learn from this. Whatever bad things happen in our lives, God is still limiting Satan. Doesn't the Apostle Paul say in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13 that God won't put more on us than we can bear? But with every temptation, He will provide a way of escape. Satan cannot do anything to us that God has not approved. And God will not allow Satan to do more to us than we can handle. Sometimes we don't think that. We had some friends of ours down in Tennessee when we lived down there. When I was a youth minister, their dairy farm was completely destroyed by a tornado. And the dad and his teenage son were outside when the tornado was getting closer and closer and closer. And they were doing things outside, I don't know, getting the barn boarded up or whatever. And the dad saw his son one moment riding his four-wheeler towards the house, and then he is shutting the gate, and he can't see his son, and then he sees the four-wheeler flying. And for a few minutes, he thought his son was gone. He actually got off the four-wheeler to lock the gate, and the tornado took the four-wheeler but not the son. The dad wound up going through stages of depression that lasted for probably a few years. And he told me one time, he said, I'm not sure but what God has put more on me than I can bear. And it's not easy for me to say, no, Charles, God's not going to put on you more than you can bear, when he lost his farm. They stopped being dairy farmers at that point. So there are bad things that happen to good people, right? Has nothing to do with sin. So this time, God says Satan cannot touch Job's life. The Hebrew word is nephesh, which is his soul. You can't touch him, his soul. You can't take his life. Now, as we go through, in fact, that second bullet point on the screen, if you want to write those verses down, go through. We don't have time to read it tonight, but go through and look at all of the physical ailments that Job experienced. Here in this text, verse 8, he's got sores that are open and running, fluids running from his sores, and he takes broken pieces of pottery. That's what potsherds they are. So he takes broken pieces of pottery and he scrapes those sores. You got to itch them, don't you? Has anybody had boils? But, what's that inflammation that's really itchy and it bleeds? Shingles. Anybody had shingles? Yeah, a few of you. You got to itch them, don't you? So Job takes these broken pieces of pottery and he scrapes these sores. Read through those verses and see what Job experiences physically. The word boil here is the same word that God put on the Egyptians. That plague of boils that we read about in Exodus chapter 9. Same word. So Job has this. What about his wife? What does his wife do, Mrs. Job? Isn't she strong and supportive? So she's not the epitome of faithfulness herself, is she? But now, she went through everything too, didn't she? Does the loss of children affect moms differently than it affects dads? Yeah. Imagine it would. But now, Mrs. Job doesn't handle it the same way. She just says, curse God, die, and let's get it over with. There was a young man in my youth group in Tennessee, in fact. Now, the event happened after I was gone, but his mom died. The young man was early 20s, and he took his own life because he couldn't adjust to not having his mom in his life. So Job's wife says, just curse God and die and get it over with. And notice that Job says, shall we not accept good from God and not accept adversity? That's kind of what he said back in chapter 1 when he says, God gives and God takes away. Let's not turn our back on God. Notice also at the end of verse 10, the author says, in all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Same thing he said back in chapter 1 verse 22. I skipped over that verse. But through all this, Job did not sin, nor did he blame God. So up to this point, Job still hasn't said anything that was out of order. And we don't know what all he said. Everything, of course, is not recorded. But why does the author keep telling us Job didn't sin? Why does he keep telling us that? Help us know it can be done to experience that kind of tragedy and not sin. And maybe it's to help us know that Job is a righteous man. Job is not suffering all of this because he was sinful. When he tells his wife, he says, you speak of one of the foolish women speak. That word fool is the harshest word in the Hebrew language for fool. The Hebrew word is Nabal. You recognize that name? Who was Nabal? Abigail's husband from 1 Samuel chapter 25. David married Abigail after God struck Nabal dead. God was going to go kill Nabal, you remember, because he wouldn't support David's family, David's soldiers, with food and so forth. So, the friends show up. What are some of the good things that the friends do? We're going to criticize the friends over the next 3 months. But what are the good things here in verses 11 through 13? Good things that the friends do. They comfort him. They mourn with him. They came to visit. They were present, right? What else did they do? They sympathized. Pat? Janet. They comforted him. I counted 8 things they did that were good. Number 1, they came to visit him. Number two, they sympathized with him, or they came to sympathize with him. It's debatable whether or not they sympathized with him. They came to sympathize with him. Number three, they came to comfort him. Number four, they raised their voices and wept. So if you're weeping, isn't it some comfort that somebody else is weeping with you? When we've talked to our daughters and they're going through something challenging in their lives, they don't want dad to give them solutions, right? They want dad to empathize with them. So the friends came to
Sometimes just being there.
just being present. Yeah. Number five, they tore their robes. So they were doing physical expressions of grief as well. They threw dust on their heads. What's the purpose of throwing dust on your head? What's the purpose of sitting in sackcloth? It's not comfortable. It's an expression of repentance. Remember when Jesus gives the parable of the publican and a tax collector, and the tax collector rather would not even look up to heaven, but he hit himself in the chest? It's all expressions of bringing pain, physical pain to yourself to go along with the emotional pain that you're experiencing. So putting ashes on your head and sitting in sackcloth is a way of bringing discomfort to you physically because you're hurting on the inside too. Sat on the ground with him, and at the beginning, verse 13, nobody talked. Yeah, that is mentioned there in verse 13, 7 days. 7 days they sat there with him, and they didn't say anything. Now, they would have been good friends if they'd have stopped right there, right? Sometimes we say too much, and I as a preacher have to remind myself if somebody's hurting, don't say too much.
What would you say to someone without that happening? What could you say?
Right. Really, what could you say? Except as Christians, of course, we can say, I'll pray for you. Yeah. So Bildad is only mentioned in the book of Job. The village of Shuhai is believed by scholars to be located near the Euphrates River. Zophar is mentioned 4 times. The Naamah is believed to be somewhere in modern-day Syria, just to give you an idea of the geographical location of where these friends are from. So they came to sympathize with Job. That same word is used in chapter 42, verse 11, at the very end of everything, and it says, Job's brothers and sisters came and they sympathized with him. His friends came to sympathize, but I don't think he got much sympathy from them, but his brothers and sisters did at the end of the book. Same verb is used. The verb to comfort, same way. Chapter 42, verse 11, his brothers and sisters came to sympathize and to comfort or console him. He did not get comfort from his friends from whom he expected to get it from. He got it from his brothers and sisters. We don't know. You read through the 42 chapters and tell us if you find anything. I don't think there is. And of course, they wept. And the text says that they saw that his pain was very great. And that is emphatic. His pain was very great. And of course, it wasn't just, it was physical pain and it was emotional pain.
Well, he was disappointed he didn't recognize him when they see him.
Yeah. He looked a mess. Have you seen somebody whom you know, but they've gone through so much that they're almost not recognizable? In fact, if you go through that kind of emotional trauma, and I think it happened with Job, don't you lose your appetite? And if you lose your appetite for a long period of time, what do you look like physically? Right? You lose weight. It's not the best way to lose weight, but you lose weight. Marvin? He is going to ask, in fact, that would be something interesting. Just go through and count the number of questions that Job asks Jump down to chapter 3 and notice in verses 20 and 23 the questions Job asked. And I'm just drawing your attention to the very first word in those two verses. Why? Why? In fact, what does Job curse in chapter 3? The fact that he was born. He curses the day he was born. Mary? Yes. We don't have any record of it. In fact, at the very end, God will tell his friends, you go to Job and let him sacrifice for you and pray for you. So God implies that he wouldn't even listen to their prayers if they did pray. That's a good question. So we don't have time to go through chapter 3 very closely. We have not gone through any of these 3 chapters very closely. But in chapter 3, Job curses the day he was born. I wish I had never been born. So he had gotten to such a point emotionally with everything that was going on that he wishes that he had never experienced any of the good things that he had experienced. The bad things overshadowed and outweighed all of the good things that he had experienced. We don't know how old his children were. Let's assume they were in their 20s, maybe 20s and above. So Job had had 20 years of happy times with them. But they got slaughtered, they got killed, and now he wishes he hadn't experienced any of those 20 years.
So did Job's children have children? The Bible doesn't say.
Not these 10. The 10 that he gets at the end of the book, and we'll get there in 3 months, those 10 have children, and the Bible says that Job got to see the 4th generation. Isn't that a blessing? Clarence, you got to see the 4th generation, right? Yep. You were going to say something?
The one thing that just stands out to me is that the one verse that says, and Job did not sin with his lips. And I just thinking about all the things he could have said. He might have been thinking about, but he did not put down God at all. He did not put down anyone. And I think, how many times do we blame others when we should have kept our mouths shut?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Job didn't blame others. Job didn't blame himself. He didn't blame his wife. He didn't blame God. At this point, he didn't sin.
He said he doesn't sin. It's not a sin to ask why.
It's not a sin to ask why, is it?
I mean, it's hard to understand, and it's natural.
In fact, when you read through the Psalms, and that's one of the reasons why I'm preaching through the Psalms, when you read through the Psalms, you will see that the psalmist will say very tough things to God. God will say, you don't take vengeance on others, you let me handle the vengeance. And if you're hurting, you throw your angry words at me, let me handle it. And of course, God can handle it. And God, again, as we read through Job's speeches, from this point on, we'll see where Job will say some harsh things to God. And you and I as Christians, on this side of the cross, we'll say, you can't say that to God. Job did. And at the end of the book, Job will say, I'll repent of what I've said. So some of the things that Job said, Job felt like that they were sinful against God. Here in chapter 3, verse 8, I just wanted to point out, he said, the person who can control Leviathan, let those who curse my birthday, who curse the day, who are prepared to arouse Leviathan. I think what he's saying is, if there's somebody who is able to arouse Leviathan and control Leviathan, then perhaps he has the power to curse the day I was born. I think that's what he's saying there. What I wanted to bring that up because Leviathan is mentioned several times in the Old Testament. The typical scholarly response is Leviathan was a mythological creature. And I don't think Leviathan was a mythological creature. We may not know exactly what kind of animal it was. A good argument can be made that it was some kind of dinosaur. But just because we don't know what kind of animal it was doesn't mean it was a myth. When we see Leviathan mentioned in Job chapter 40, God uses him as an example of an animal that God created. So whatever animal it was real, but it was also feared. How would you respond? This is the last question. How would you respond to Job's cry in chapter 3 when he said, I want to curse the day I was born? Did you put thought into that? What would you say to Job if he was your friend? Or would you just sit there in the dust and ashes and keep your mouth shut? Give him a hug. Anna likes hugs. I guess Jill does too, but Anna's verbal about it. What would you say to Job? It's not easy, is it? I hope you haven't had any friends or family members that have gone through what Job has gone through. I mean, I know some of you have lost children, and that surely is probably the most painful thing you can experience. But Job lost all of them at one time. As we deal with the problem of suffering in the world, there are some points here that I want to bring out. No discussion, just reminding you, and this goes beyond the book of Job, okay? These last points, and I'm just going to share you a few points each Wednesday night. But these last points have to do with the teachings of the nature of God and His plans for man that are beyond the book of Job, that relate to why does God allow suffering in the world. Okay, this first point, first screen here is just the nature of God. He is all powerful, He is all good, He is all wise, and He is completely just. So when we deal with suffering, I think we have to start off with who is God. And this coming Sunday will be one of the sermons in that series, and we'll talk about God is immortal. What does it mean for us to say that God is immortal? That'll be the sermon for Sunday morning. Next Wednesday night, Jacob will do, you remember I mentioned that he's got 2 lessons on the book of Job, so he'll do his first lesson next Wednesday night, and then he works a week, and then he'll be back the next Wednesday night. And he'll cover the whole story of Job in those 2 lessons. So he'll talk about the end of Job, but then we'll go back and we'll fill in the gaps. Anybody have any questions or comments you want to shoot at me? I'm over time, so now I'm on your time. Let's have a quick prayer. Our Father in heaven, we are thankful for your love for us and for your patience with us. And we're thankful, Father, that regardless of what we go through, you're still by our side and we still have a better home waiting for us. Help us, Father, to live with that promise in our hearts. Keep us in your care as we dismiss and bring us back again on the Lord's day. In His name we pray. Amen.